Well, that's what I was going to ask you about too, though, because you said you don't have an artist that big that you could warrant that kind of swagger, but you did manage Nirvana, who was arguably even bigger.
Well,
in some respects.
Well, I mean, they were never as big in terms of the amount of money they made because they just didn't tour as much.
Right.
Because Kurt didn't like touring that much.
But cultural importance-wise.
Culture important-wise, they're on the A list.
Yeah.
Well, I carried Peter Grant. I wrote a book that came out earlier this year about working with Kurt called Serving the Servant,
right.
Remembering Kurt Cobain. And in it, I kept thinking, what would Peter Grant do? You know, and how would he handle this? And I would often think about certain things about like Lollapalooza wanted Nirvana to be on, and to be fair, I mean, I had a partner in managing Nirvana named John Silva, who today is an incredibly successful manager, has the Foo Fighters, many other big bands. But in those days, I was like the 40-year-old veteran, and John was younger, and John knew the music and the culture much better and did a lot of the work. But I played my role, and I remember when they were offered Lollapalooza the first time, talking with Kurt, and I said, look, Led Zeppelin wouldn't have done this. Led Zeppelin did their own shows. Right. You know, and my idea is that you're big enough, you create your own, if you want to do something like, you do your own thing. Right. And, you know, I'm not saying Kurt did what he wanted to do for his own reasons, but they never did do Lollapalooza. Right. And I had nothing against Lollapalooza. I only wish I'd thought of Lollapalooza. Right. And no, but that makes an incredible cultural thing. But for that particular band, I did think through the lens of how Peter Grant thought about Nirvana as is to create their own world, not to try to latch on to other people's worlds, you know. Yeah, you mean how Peter Grant thought of Led Zeppelin? Yeah, how Peter Grant thought of Zeppelin, you know, right. In certain ways. A totally different kind of band. I mean, Kurt had all the social consciousness that Zeppelin didn't have, and you know, Zeppelin had a physical commitment to touring that Nirvana, you know, that Kurt never had, and it was a different kind of music and a different time. But you know, I think I was a much better manager, and I think to this day I'm a better manager because I work for Peter Grant. There's just no question about it. Right. But so writing about the Kurt Cobain thing, like that's brought up a bunch of wild controversy too, like around his death and stuff like that. I mean, what's your feeling and take on all that stuff? Well, I mean, you know, I had because I knew him and I was there for a lot of it. I mean, I didn't take drugs with him, I didn't play music with him, and I wasn't the punk rock generation. But I, you know, it was nice that he said that in an interview. But I looked at it more of as a big brother. Not, you know, he was smarter than me, more talented than me. You know, there's no question about that. But in certain areas, I could be of help to him psychologically. He had zero relationship with his own father. You know? I only met his father once at the funeral. You know, you know. So I'm happy to talk about him, but I knew what I thought because I was there. It was a challenging of putting it into a book form, and I spoke to around 40 other people, Courtney and Chris Novoselic, as well as, you know, Scott Litt and a couple of the record producers, people at the label, the people who knew him when I knew him. I wasn't trying to do a biography of Kurt. I didn't do his childhood. The last 3 years of his life. The last 3 years of his life when I worked with him. And that helped me to bring it to life and to flesh it out. But I knew what I thought about the so-called controversies when I started out, and I'm happy to talk about any of them. But his death, I mean, he killed himself. You know? Yeah. He was prone to depression. He was on again, off again junkie. He liked guns. We prayed that it wouldn't happen, and unfortunately it did. He was in and out of rehab many times, and everybody around him tried to introduce him to counselors and get him into 12 steps. He didn't like 12 steps. You know, it's like, I tell you, 12 steps has saved the lives of many people very, very, very close to me. Yeah. Well, I heard Kurt Cobain call you a second father in an interview. Well, that was amazing that he said that. On the John Savage interview? John Savage. That was a great fucking, excuse my French, interview. Or it's more like a pre-podcast, before podcast on YouTube of John Savage and Kurt Cobain. Well, you know, I listened. I had not heard. Didn't hear that? I had seen the article years ago. It's on YouTube. But I hadn't heard it. And then when I was researching the book, I just wanted to hear Kurt's voice.
Yeah.
At some point, I got stuck writing, and I went on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I came across it and listened to it. And when
Right.
I heard him say that, I just started crying. This is just like a year ago.
And that was after he said you weren't even managing him
Right.
anymore, and he said that.
I
so
know.
that was a very sweet thing. I listened to it last night in
Oh, wow.
preparation. Yeah. And when I got to that, I was like, oh, man.
Yeah, it blew my mind when I heard it. It's just, again, I had not heard his voice saying that until last year, exactly what you're saying on YouTube.
Right.
But Kurt was that way. He was so nice to me.
Yeah, but that is it does become a family kind of thing when you are managed by people. It does, those lines do blur.
Yeah, they blur a little bit. There's a certain kind of a gravitas you need to have for people to have confidence in you, that you understand enough about them, number one, and number two, that you understand enough about the business that you can do something for them. And it's that perception. It's not always based in reality, but that perception is what makes somebody say, okay, fine, be my manager.
Right.
You know, so
but that's a recurring
it took me a
theme.
while. It took me a while. I never really got traction doing that until until I was well into my 30s, is when I finally kind of found a tone and a posture that was actually able to build some management clients. But there was a whole other dimension in corporations of sort of understanding the financial requirements of a corporation and the politics of different levels of the corporation that I never really mastered, which is why I only spent 6 years at major labels. But I had enough hits that I was able to spend 6 years in those big jobs, and I made more money in those 6 years than I did any other time before or after.
And were you still a manager while you were doing that?
Well, I wasn't much of a you know, when I first went to Atlantic, Kurt was still alive,
right?
And because of the way that things had developed in the relationships of the people around Nirvana, I developed this personal relationship with him that was unique among the business people in his life. And the main reason for that was that I got along with Courtney, who was his wife, and a lot of other people. When he first fell in love with her, people didn't think it was going to last and weren't particularly nice to her. I just sort of, that was an advantage of being older. You know, there were advantages of being younger when I was younger, but the advantage of then I was older than the other people that were around the band in their 20s, and I just knew he was in love with her. I knew it wasn't some groupie or anything like that. I just got it right away. So by this time, after Nevermind was out, I was really attracted to the idea of leaving management and working for a big company. First of all, I had a sense of the fragility of Nirvana commercially, because I realized Kurt had some problems. Secondly, I'd had my first kid. My daughter, Katie, was born in 1990, so she's 1 or 2 years old. And being a manager, you're traveling a lot. And it was you know, when I went to work for Atlantic, I had weekends. It was like, it was
unbelievable.
You know,
I was just curious. I was in the office when you were not here. There's that letter on the wall that Kurt wrote to Juliana. And in it he says, you could explain what's behind it, but he says, as long as I've known Danny Goldberg, he's a great guy. As long as he's in our life, we'll be okay.
No, it's very sweet. That's the same period of time probably when he did that interview with John Savage, because I was at Atlantic by then. What happened is, you had asked me earlier, is when I went to work for Atlantic, my deal with the company was that I could continue to be a co-manager of Nirvana, and that was in everybody's interest. That was my whole brand. I was the Nirvana guy. That's what they were buying. You know, at that time we was trying to sign artists that were in that then commercial genre. It turned out to be a brief period, but and the relationship with Kurt. So I continued to play that role in the business stuff for him. When he had certain issues, he just would want to talk to me about it. But and then when I was at Atlantic, I was always thinking of, I wanted to sign things that he thought were cool. That's why I signed the Melvins, and he produced the Melvins record. And you know, I didn't know he would be into. So Juliana Hatfield was on a label called Mammoth. One of the first deals. My job was to bring, you know, alternative rock to Atlantic. They had the Lemonheads. They had a couple of bands in that lane, but they were behind Geffen and Warner Brothers in the alternative rock space, and that was kind of my first task. And so I bought a label called Mammoth Records that had Juliana on it, and she put out this album, and she had a song called Nirvana on the record because she loved him so much, and then she had this great song called My Sister, which was kind of the MTV song. And so I didn't know any, and so then after he died, Juliana shared with me a fax that Kurt had sent her. There was no internet. Internet was just starting. So the big thing was faxes. Kurt loved faxing because he didn't want to wait for a letter to be delivered, and there was nobody was doing email yet. So there's a lot of Kurt faxes in his own handwriting, and he sent her one because she had come to see a show of his, and he felt bad that he hadn't been nice enough. This guy was the sweetest guy in the world. His darkness was all interdirected. He couldn't have been more considerate and sweet to other people. So it bothered him that he had been just said hi and hadn't schmoozed her or made her feel good. So he sent her this fax, and in it he mentioned he knew that her record was coming out via Atlantic that I was by then running or involved with. I forget whether I'd president yet or still just the A&R dude. And he said a couple of nice sentences about me, and she said, I thought you'd want to see this. So, after he died, it obviously loomed larger as a thing, as an artifact of him, So I didn't know at the time that he had written it, but after he died, she sent that to me, and I've always treasured it because it's such a nice of him to have said that about me in writing. And it's not like he told me he did it. It was just it's the same as the John Savage thing. He didn't say, "Hey man, I just said I said this thing to John." It was just that was his thing about me, and
he had a lot
I can't
of love
thank
for
him
you.
enough. I mean, he did a lot more for me than I did for him, but I was there for him any way I could be that I knew of consciously, and I hope the book reflects and shines a light on his creative side, his humor, his warmth. You can't deny his dark side. He killed himself.
Yeah, and his music was full of that darkness.
Yeah, I don't sugarcoat that, but it's like I try to shine the light more on that side of him than I think some of the other media about him does. And that was kind of the idea of the book, was to just kind of a little more of a romanticized, just focus on his greatness. Like I always say, look, Jimi Hendrix killed himself. I don't know whether it was intentional or not, but he died the same age. Yeah. By his own hand. It was heroin instead of a gun. But when I think of Hendrix, I think of his guitar solos. Yeah. I don't think of his death. Yeah. Right. And I think when a lot of fans of Nirvana, I think they think of those Unplugged and In Utero and Come As You Are and Smells Like Teen Spirit and All Apologies and his cover of the Bowie song, Man Who Sold the World, and that voice,
incredible voice.
And I mean, to talk to the engineers who made the records, I talked to Butch Vig, who did Nevermind, and Scott Litt, who remixed In Utero and who did Unplugged. He says, we did nothing. That was how he sounded. Yeah. And the sound man too. I talked to who was their sound man for the first 80% of their crew was a guy named Craig Montgomery. He ended up getting fired 6 months before Kurt died, but he did like hundreds and hundreds of shows. He says, my job was to make sure people could hear him sing. Right. That was the whole job. It was like people, all of his other qualities were so amazing as a songwriter, producer, a conceptualizer of rock, artist, activist, supporter of other artists. But on top of that, and he was a very good guitar player. He was the lead guitar player of Nirvana.
He was great. Great guitar player. Great solos.
But if he only sang, he would have been a star just as a singer.
Yeah, for sure.
And his voice smooth. So I just want to shine a light on the side of him that I knew. It was not the only side of him, and there's 50 different versions of Kurt. He was a complicated guy, but I tried to just remember him as best I could with the help of the people I worked with at the time, and I loved him. I really loved him. What a guy.
I love the title of it too, the book.
Oh, thanks. Serving the Servant.
How'd you come up with that? I mean, I know he's got the song.
Well, you know how it is. I mean, trying to think of a good title.
Yeah.
And I just was in a panic. What's the title? I had other working titles that I knew weren't good, and then so I figured, well, song titles are always good. My previous book, I ripped off a song title, In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, and the Hippie Idea. So I just went through. I'm going through all the songs. I see Serving the Servant, Serve the Servants, which is the lead track on In Utero. And I thought I could turn into Serving the Servant, which was both an homage to that song.
Yeah.
I love In Utero. It's my favorite Nirvana
It's my
record.
favorite, too.
And I also thought, and I put this in the book, I said, that he was the servant of a muse that only he could hear, but that he could then translate so millions of people could hear it. And then people who worked for him, our job was to try to serve him. I mean, he was the genius. He did everything in Nirvana. No disrespect. Obviously, Dave Grohl's incredibly talented. Chris Novoselic, talented and one of the great human beings ever. But Kurt wrote the lyrics and the music, lead guitar player and the lead singer, storyboarded all the videos, designed the album covers, and made every single decision.
Yeah.
So, I'm just saying he was that guy, and everybody else's job. And I think Chris, I think, would say the same thing. He knew him from high school. Was how do you help him do his thing? And to me, it kind of defined what the idea was of being a manager. So
right.
And I thought, and I couldn't think of a better title. Its titles are.
It's hard.
But
you get a good one.
But you get a good one. It's so helpful.
Yeah. Another interesting thing on that John Savage interview was him saying, like, it was a foreshadowing because he said, I'd like to do something where me and Dave switch places. He says that in the interview.
He told me.
So that was interesting because I was like, damn, he saw what Dave Grohl was capable of.
Listen, man, I wish I had seen it. I always joke, if I had known how talented Dave Grohl was, I would have hung out with him a lot more. I was so obsessed with the singer. That's my thing, is hang out with the singer and songwriter. That was a bit of a mistake. But Kurt told me he was a great singer.
Yeah.
Kurt said, you don't understand, I hear him singing harmony. He's great. And I didn't know what Kurt meant until later.
Right.
But Kurt knew. No, listen, he had his problems.
Yeah.
Obviously. But he was one of the smartest in the rock world, one of the greats. He was on that short list with Dylan, Springsteen, Lennon.
Yeah.
He's on that, Bob Marley. He's on that list. He was a fucking real life genius.
I mean, he got me to write songs.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. That's when I was a bass player, and then Nirvana came out, and I was like, holy shit. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of my biggest influences.
Oh, wow. We never talked about that.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, he was the real deal.